The indifference of king and parliament, the British mismanagement that led to revolution. A quick history snippet by Gelda Boer, with audio by 11 Labs. Between 1763 and 1776, a series of restrictive acts and policies, along with escalating tensions, transformed many American colonists from loyal subjects of the British Crown into revolutionary men intent on achieving independence. Although Britain relied heavily on its colonies for trade and economic prosperity, its government imposed taxes and regulations without representation from the colonies. King George III's indifference to colonial petitions for redress of grievances further deepened colonial resentment. This combination of mismanagement, arrogance, and disregard for colonial grievances steadily eroded loyalty to the British Crown and fostered a climate of resistance. Ultimately, these cumulative pressures ignited armed conflict in 1775 and culminated in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, marking the birth of the American Revolution. The American colonies were of vital importance to the British Empire. Not only did they bring prosperity through land and raw materials, but also through trade and commerce. The British fought to keep their colonies safe during the French and Indian War. The war raged for nearly 10 years on the American continent. After the French and Indian War concluded in 1763, there was a sense of relief among the colonists. The war had helped to secure the colonies against French aggressions, and there was a general sense of peace with Britain's victory. France conceded their American continental lands to the British, and there was no longer a war. Both Britain and the colonies celebrated and took pride in this success. While the war had ended, there were tensions among the native population and colonists. Britain had kept outposts in remote locations and did not remove them once the French-Indian War ended, as promised. The Native Americans saw this as a betrayal of promises by the British. Colonial settlers and frontiersmen were settling in these new areas and pushing past the boundaries of current settlements. After tensions led to hostile acts by the Native Americans, which were met with force by British troops, King George issued the Proclamation Line of 1763. The purpose of this proclamation was to assert British control over new territories and to limit the expansion of settlements by the colonists into these new territories. The act outlined how Native American trade was to be established in the interior, and there was to be no colonization or settling beyond the Appalachian Ridge. These were not new promises, but a restatement of those made within the Treaty of Essen in 1758, which had not been enforced and had been mostly ignored. King George was a very young king and had only ascended to the throne at 21 years old in 1760. His upbringing had been one of limited education, between the rancor of his grandfather and father, and limited to the outside world. Due to the experiences caught between his parent and grandparent, he viewed many of the government officials as needing an overhaul and sought a restoration of being a king through controlling his ministers and parliament. He became enamored of men in seeking father types of relationships, and many of these soured as he went back and forth between adoration and disillusionment with ministers and parliamentary figures. Much of Parliament was made up of the peerage, engaged in their own selfish pursuits and living excessive lifestyles disconnected from the common man. Many of them did not agree on policies, and many of them, along with the cabinet of the king, turned over quite often and were capricious in nature. This dynamic was not the greatest base from which to rule an empire and properly consider the needs of colonists an ocean away. Parliament needed to pay off the debts incurred by the 7 Years' War and raise revenue to pay the cost of keeping the colonies safe. In 1754, members from the colonies had met with Mohawk Valley inhabitants, Crown representatives, and other members of the local communities to attempt to create a unified identity, provide defense of the colonies by colonists and not British troops, and pay for this. Benjamin Franklin was one of the colonial representatives in attendance and also one of the originators of the Albany Congress Plan. Unfortunately, Britain, by way of provincial leadership, saw this as giving the colonists too many rights and rejected this plan. Had the plan been adopted, it might have saved money and bloodshed on the part of Britain and the colonists and potentially changed the timeline of the Revolutionary War. Britain moved forward with British troops as well as colonial soldiers, and a war debt was incurred. With the need to pay off the debt, a series of revenue acts were passed over nearly a 10-year period from 1764 through 1773 and were known as the Revenue Acts. The intention was to have the American colonies assist with paying for their defense and assist with this debt. This series of revenue acts did not generate the expected revenue to pay off the war debt. Through different ministers and parliamentary steps, the Revenue Acts served to create dissent among the American colonists. The acts, decisions, and events not only increased the likelihood but also led to the result of revolution by the American colonists. In 1764, the British Parliament passed the American Revenue Act of 1764. This was known more commonly as the Sugar Act. The Prime Minister during this time was George Grenville. He was in his early 50s and a staunchly honest and economical man. An act to raise revenue and pay off debts was one that he supported and helped to push quickly through Parliament. The act was designed to modify the previous Sugar and Molasses Act and to tighten the enforcement of taxes and regulations that were not being properly followed. The previous act was being evaded, and taxes were not being collected on molasses and sugar being smuggled into the colonies, resulting in a loss of tax revenue. The new act lowered the duties on molasses, but replaced the sugar tax with taxes imposed on different items such as coffee, wine, and other luxury goods, and increased taxes on French Caribbean rum. Tax revenues raised from the new tax were to be spent on supporting the British Army, with the aim of protecting the American colonies. Because smuggling had increased during the period of the 7 Years' War, this act also had provisions to improve the integrity of the trade, limit smuggling, and improve honesty in the customs process. Dishonest customs officers were to be held to higher standards and face stiffer punishments for deceit. Cases involving customs were to be heard in a British court at a location in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and not in more sympathetic colonial common law courts. This was done to ensure smugglers were not given special treatment. The Sugar Act was one of the first direct impositions of taxes on American colonists, and it was not well received. The British Parliament and Prime Minister Grenville had not sought the input or representation of the colonies in Parliament to make the decision or craft the act. As such, the act was considered taxation without representation. Both the new taxes and the relocation of the court angered the colonists. This act was one of the first markers that set the stage for the coming revolt. Prime Minister Grenville and the British Parliament imposed a new tax act in 1765 that was even less popular than the Sugar Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 imposed a direct tax on the colonists for the purpose of raising revenue to defray the costs of troops in colonial America and to pay off the war debt from the French and Indian War. It placed a stamp duty throughout the British colonies and was applied on items such as documents for civil pleadings, on surveying rights, and land transfers. Many of the fees were to be payable in silver, which placed a great burden on the colonists, as most of them did not deal in silver coin or have robust banking systems such as those available in England. The most brutal hit was on the population that could least afford the taxes. The cruel part of the act was the tax on wills and writs of dower. Unless those that were grieving had funds to secure their inheritance, they had to borrow or risk losing it if unable to pay the taxes. Due to the lack of silver to pay taxes required by the Stamp Act to secure their property, colonists protested in the streets in anger. Riots broke out across many cities. Colonists used intimidation and violence and embargoed imports and exports. Afraid of mob violence, the stamp distributors resigned. From farmers to merchants, most colonists were outraged at the burdens imposed. Because of the lack of silver to pay the taxes, the act had a flattening effect on both the rich and the poor alike. Both the lack of representation in the imposition of the tax and the burdensome, oppressive nature of the act caused widespread anger throughout all of the colonies. Parliament was ignorant of American circumstances and, without proper representation from the colonies, had created a burdensome tax act. It was seen as an act of parliamentary tyranny, was likened to oppressive slavery, and began revolutionary arguments among many colonists. 9 colonies sent representatives to New York to draft a petition against the Stamp Act in October of 1765. This was the first time that colonists convened a Continental Congress in response to policies by their king and his government. A petition, called Declaration of Rights and Grievances, was created, and it made clear that if the Stamp Act was not repealed, any advantages from the colonies would be lost due to the burden of the Stamp Act. To restore the commercial benefit of trade, the Stamp Act was repealed by Parliament in 1766. Rather than work with the colonists to come up with a solution to raise revenue for the protection of the colonies and to pay off the war debt, the British Parliament moved forward with new acts. Immediately following the repeal of the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. This act reaffirmed that Parliament had the authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. During this period, there was also turmoil at the head of the British government. Grenville had been replaced as Prime Minister by Charles Wentworth Watson in 1765, and then shortly afterwards, William Pitt became Prime Minister in 1767. Even though he was Prime Minister, Pitt was often ill and absent. As such, Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, stood in and pushed his ideas for new revenue with Parliament. England's debt had grown quite large, and Parliament argued that the American colonies should assist with the burden. Townshend had spent considerable time on the Board of Trade and had become familiar with colonial trade and matters. He'd previously argued for more taxation on the colonies and had been a supporter of the Sugar Act. He argued and pushed through Parliament a series of acts that became known as the Townshend Acts. These were passed in quick succession after the Declaratory Act, which was passed almost immediately after the repeal of the Stamp Act. The purpose of this act was to assert the power of the British Parliament in all cases whatsoever, including the right to tax. The first Townshend Act was the New York Restraining Act of 1767, which banned the Governor and Assembly of New York from passing any new bills until they complied with the Quartering Act of 1766. The Quartering Act required the owner of the house or the establishment to house, feed, and supply British soldiers. The next was the Revenue Act of 1767, which placed duties on items such as certain colored glass, pasteboard, paper, red and white lead, painter's colors, fruits, wine, and tea. Another was the Indemnity Act of 1767, which reduced taxes on the British Tea Company to allow them to sell tea more cheaply to the colonies. It was hoped that with more tea sold at a better price, it would, in turn, raise more revenue. Also, selling tea cheaper would prevent tea smuggling due to the difficulty of competing with lower-priced tea. The Commissioners of Customs Act of 1767 was another of the Townshend Acts. This act established and headquartered in Boston an American Customs Board. While it was in Boston, it was staffed by the British. Charles Townshend died in 1767 and did not get to see the final passage of the Vice Admiralty Court Act 1768, the final of the Townshend Acts. The court in Halifax was too far to see many cases, and this established a court within the colonies that was more convenient to hear smuggling and other trade-related cases. The Townshend Acts also did not raise the revenues desired or planned upon by the British Parliament. They further infuriated the colonists, who responded with protests and acts of outrage. The American lawyer and farmer from Philadelphia, John Dickinson, wrote a series of essays called The Farmer's Letters that were published in the Pennsylvania Chronicle beginning in 1767. The essay letters detailed the reasons why the people of the colonies needed to take action and oppose the Townshend Acts, as well as acts of oppression and taxation without representation by the British government. The public responded with action, and resistance to the British was stirred up quite effectively by the letters that were published in many newspapers across the colonies. They not only protested, but also boycotted trade from England. Trade dropped considerably on goods from England. The expected revenue was not raised, and due to the boycott, the acts were nearly ineffective in achieving their purpose of raising revenue. Parliament thought that because the taxes were indirect and duties, the colonists would be more accepting of them. The real effect was the rebellious nature and resistance to the British that was stirred up in the colonists. King George failed to comprehend the sentiments of the colonists. To him, they were subjects and, as such, should be loyal to the Crown and Britain. Accordingly, they needed to obey the acts of Parliament and their king. Distanced as he was from not only his people, but even more from the colonists in both distance and status, King George did not understand the rebellious resistance of the colonists to taxation for their own defense and safety. It did not help that Britain lacked steady leadership with a long-term prime minister or sustainable policies, instead thrusting multiple acts upon the colonies. Lord North became the prime minister in 1770, and yet another new ministry was created, potentially introducing a new set of policies for the colonies. Lord North and Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts in 1770, with the exception of the tea duty, but this was overshadowed by another event that occurred in Boston. Tensions came to a head in Boston on a night in March, as a crowd of young men taunted soldiers guarding a Boston custom house with sticks and icy snowballs. A frustrated and worried British soldier fired into the crowd, and chaos erupted. As a result, 5 colonists were killed and many more were injured. Propaganda pictures made by Paul Revere showing a calm crowd being fired upon by the British were distributed throughout Boston and the colonies, further riling up the Americans. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, in 1773, Lord North and Parliament passed the Tea Act. It was yet another act that was not accepted well by the American colonists. The purpose of the act was not to raise revenues to benefit the colonies, but instead to raise funds for the India Tea Company by selling tea to the colonies at a cheap price. Not only did it create a monopoly for the India Tea Company, but it also served to fuel the already simmering anger of the colonists. Protests erupted in many cities and throughout Boston. The colonists were once again taxed without their input or representation. On the night of December 16, 1773, protesters dressed as Native Americans snuck aboard one of the tea company ships. They dumped tea into Boston Harbor, totaling approximately 11,000 pounds sterling. The response by the British government was swift. Lord North and Parliament passed the coercive acts known in America as the Intolerable Acts of 1774. These were a series of almost retaliatory acts in direct response to the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Charter was rewritten to limit representation among the colonists, and a new American commander, General Thomas Gage, was appointed. The Boston Harbor was closed until all taxes were paid, and the India Tea Company was reimbursed for the cost of the tea dumped into the harbor. Any royal officials were allowed to transfer cases to be heard in England, which gave them preferential treatment. The growing anger and unrest among the colonists finally turned to bloodshed in the first armed conflict between the colonists and the British in April of 1775. Commander Gage ordered troops to march to Concord to secure or destroy military arms caches that had been hidden by colonists. American colonists, including Paul Revere, rode ahead, sending out a warning and gathering men together to meet the British troops. Militiamen and Minutemen hastily drew together to defend against the coming British troops. On the morning of April 19, the British troops opened fire and exchanged shots with the American militia. Not long after this event, America was declared in open and avowed rebellion. Although fighting had begun and war loomed, many of the colonists sought a peaceful way to resolve the conflict. A pivotal moment occurred on July 5, 1775, when the Continental Congress adopted a conciliatory letter penned by John Dickinson, author of Letters from a Farmer, known as the Olive Branch Petition. In this petition, the Second Continental Congress sought to assure the king that their grievances were directed not personally towards him, but rather at Parliament, and that they were loyal subjects. It was also the last attempt at reconciliation, and Dickinson hoped it would spark negotiations. There was still hope that the king would stand up to Parliament and act in the best interest of his subjects. In August of 1775, Richard Penn and Arthur Lee carried the petition to London and delivered it to Secretary Lord Dartmouth, but the king refused to receive it. The indifference from King George made it clear to the colonists that Parliament was acting with the king's awareness and consent. The king, instead, issued a proclamation declaring a state of rebellion, and he branded all colonists who henceforth joined the American resistance as guilty of traitorous designs. It wasn't until the following November that Congress learned first of the proclamation of rebellion, before it then learned of the rejection of the Olive Branch Petition. This was the final attempt at reconciliation, and the cold indifference by the king cleared the way for the Continental Congress to contemplate military necessities. War had been fought for more than a year, since April of 1775, with king's armies and navy arriving almost daily. The colonists' grievances or petitions had been met with cold indifference, and rather than negotiations for peace or liberty, the king had tendered the sword for liberty, chains, and for safety, death. As the British mobilized a massive army and navy in America, the colonies mobilized towards independence. Across the colonies, some towns and cities were debating and drafting their own declarations and resolutions of independence. As public sentiment shifted more towards independence, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. In early July 1776, the tone of the Declaration of Independence reflected this shift in the emotions and spirit of the colonists as they transitioned from a reconciliatory to a rebellious stance. This document laid out the explanation for the dissolution of the bonds between the British and American people, as it became necessary for the American people to dissolve the political bands that had connected them. In a few short years, the American colonists had transformed from loyal British subjects to rebellious colonists, determined to achieve their own independence. British mismanagement, which included various acts, poor management decisions, and foolish, often ignorant, and arrogant actions, caused loyal British subjects to rebel and eventually led to the American Revolution. These actions and decisions by the British are the main reasons for rebellion and the colonists' Declaration of Independence. Without the multiple acts that forced taxation without representation and came across as indifferent, oppressive, and tyrannical, the colonists might not have responded in revolt. From the Proclamation Line of 1763 through the Intolerable Acts of 1774, The multiple decisions and acts by the British government in between, and the indifference of King George to the pleadings of the colonists in petitions to him, all led to the first shots exchanged in the Lexington Alarm of 1775 and then resulted in the colonists declaring independence in 1776.